A cursed item changes hands, ruining lives. Wherever it goes. The winter storm had already swallowed the streets by the time I found the antique shop. Its presence was unmarked, almost secret, the kind of place you might only find by accident. The window was fogged, and faint candlelight spilled onto the slick cobblestones. There was no sign or name, only a door slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I didn't mean to stop, but something about the shop called to me. Maybe it was the strange silence around it, the way the howling wind seemed to die as I approached. Or maybe it was curiosity, a weak spot of mine, luring me into dark corners of the unknown. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decaying paper and old wood. Shadows clung to the edges of the room, dancing faintly as a single flickering lantern swayed from the ceiling. The shop was a labyrinth of shelves, crowded with forgotten relics, cracked porcelain dolls with glassy eyes, yellowed books whose titles had long since faded, and ornate trinkets that seemed to hum faintly with their own stories. I wandered deeper, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. That's when I saw it. The locket. It lay in a dusty glass case, its dull surface glinting faintly under the lantern light. The chain was long and delicate, and the pendant itself was etched with intricate patterns that seemed to twist the longer I stared. There was something hypnotic about it, an unsettling pull that made me lean closer, my breath fogging the glass. "It chooses its owner," a voice rasped. Startled, I turned to see an old woman standing behind the counter. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes sharp and glittering like polished onyx. She wore a heavy shawl that draped her stooped frame, her hands gnarled with age but steady as they rested on the counter. "The locket?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. She nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale." I tried to sound casual, but her intensity unnerved me. She smiled faintly, a sharp curve of lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Not this. That locket carries a weight you cannot understand. Its story is older than you, older than me. It's not an object, it's a burden." I laughed, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. "What kind of burden?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It brings ruin to all who wear it. It feeds on despair, on misfortune. And when it's done, it does not let go." I should have left. A normal person would have laughed off her warning and gone back into the storm, content to let the strange shop and its keeper remain a passing oddity. But I couldn't. My curiosity had turned to fixation, and before I could stop myself, I found the words spilling out of my mouth. "How much?" Her face darkened, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a brass key, its surface tarnished and green with age. "If you insist," she murmured, unlocking the glass case with a single fluid motion. I didn't miss the way her hands trembled as she lifted the locket from its resting place. "Take it," she said, holding it out to me like an offering. "But don't say I didn't warn you." The locket was colder than I expected, the metal biting into my palm like frostbite. It felt heavier than it should, its weight out of place for something so small. I slipped it into my pocket, avoiding the woman's gaze as I handed her a crumpled bill. The storm had grown fiercer when I left, the wind cutting through my coat as I trudged home. The locket felt warm now, almost alive, as if it had absorbed the heat from my body. But when I glanced down at my hand, I froze. There, faint but unmistakable, was a dark smudge on my palm, shaped like the outline of the locket. It began the first night. At first I thought it was just the storm, the sound of branches clawing at the window, the whistling wind finding its way through cracks in the old walls. But then came the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of dry leaves. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a lingering memory of the shopkeeper's warning. But as the hours crept by, the whispers grew louder, forming shapes I couldn't quite understand. By dawn, I was exhausted, my mind heavy with unease. I tried to shake it off, blaming the tension on my overactive imagination. But the locket wouldn't let me forget. At work, I felt its weight pulling at my neck, dragging me down like an anchor. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concern. It wasn't until I got home that I realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were faint, buried beneath the hum of the city, but they were there, persistent, insistent, weaving themselves into my thoughts. That night, the dreams began. I found myself standing in a darkened room, its walls pulsing with faint light. The locket hung before me, suspended in midair, its chain twisting like a snake. Voices surrounded me, hissing my name, their tones both pleading and mocking. I woke drenched in sweat, the taste of metal sharp on my tongue. The days blurred together after that. Strange things began happening, small at first, but impossible to ignore. Objects in my apartment shifted when I wasn't looking. Shadows moved where there was no light. My friends stopped calling, their voices strained and distant when I reached out. By the end of the week, I was certain the locket was alive, and it wanted something. By the second week, the locket had embedded itself into my life. Its presence was like a shadow, always lingering just out of sight, its weight on my chest a constant reminder that I had invited something malevolent into my world. The whispers grew bolder, no longer faint. They ebbed and flowed like a tide, rising to a cacophony when I was alone. My name echoed within their undulating murmurs, spoken by voices that were neither entirely human nor wholly alive. One night, after another fitful attempt at sleep, I decided I had to understand what I'd brought home. My hands trembled as I searched online, sifting through forms and forgotten archives about cursed relics, alchemical artifacts, and the occult. I found nothing until I stumbled across an obscure blog titled Artifacts of Ruin. My pulse quickened as I scrolled through the posts. Amid entries about cursed mirrors and bewitched heirlooms was a single entry titled The Devourer's Locket. The description was unnervingly accurate. A small silver locket, its surface engraved with ancient symbols. The text detailed its creation by a nameless alchemist who, in desperation to cheat death, bound his soul to the object. Each owner, the blog claimed, became fuel for the locket, their despair feeding the alchemist's eternal existence. The writer described the same symptoms I was experiencing: whispers, shadowed movements, an oppressive aura. But it was the final sentence that chilled me to my core. Those who possess the locket cannot escape. They are marked, their fates bound to its curse until death. The air in the room seemed to thicken. My vision swam, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint laugh echoing through the walls. But there was one glimmer of hope. The blog mentioned a scholar, a historian named Dr. Elias Marlowe, who had dedicated his life to studying and neutralizing cursed objects. He had traced the origins of the locket to a crumbling estate 2 towns over, a place where the curse first began. Clinging to this thread of salvation, I contacted Dr. Marlowe, begging for his help. His response came almost immediately, though his tone was grim. Meet me at the estate. But be warned, the locket will not let you go so easily. I arrived at the estate on a gray, rain-soaked evening. The house was a ruin, its skeletal remains wrapped in creeping ivy and decay. Dr. Marlowe waited near the entrance, his face lined with years of exhaustion and worry. "You brought it, didn't you?" he said without preamble, his voice heavy. I nodded, pulling the locket from my pocket. The moment I held it up, The air around us shifted, growing colder, denser. Dr. Marlowe grimaced. It knows we're here. Come, there's no time to waste. Inside, the estate was a mausoleum of secrets. The walls were covered in faded murals depicting strange rituals, shadowed figures standing before a locket suspended in fire. At the center of the house, in a room that reeked of damp and rot, Marlowe knelt before a makeshift altar. This is where it was created, he explained, gesturing to a circle of symbols etched into the floor. And this is where it must be destroyed. But you must understand, it won't give up its hold on you without a fight. As he began preparing the ritual, the locket grew warm in my hand. I felt its chain coil around my fingers like a snake, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Place it in the circle, Marlowe commanded. I hesitated, my body unwilling to obey. A sudden wave of nausea overtook me as the whispers shifted, forming words in a language I didn't understand. My vision darkened, and I stumbled, the world spinning. Focus, Marlowe shouted, pulling me back. It's trying to break you. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I threw the locket into the circle. It landed with a metallic clang, and the house seemed to shudder as if alive. The moment the locket hit the ground, the symbols around the circle flared to life. A pale blue light spilled across the room, illuminating the mural's ghastly details. Shadows writhed on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that defied reason. Marlowe's voice cut through the chaos as he began chanting in an ancient tongue. His words were sharp and guttural, each syllable resonating with a power that seemed to clash against the locket's malevolence. Suddenly, the whispers shifted into screams. The locket trembled, its surface glowing with a sickly green light. From within, a figure began to emerge, a skeletal form wreathed in dark tendrils, its face a hollow mask of hatred. It towered over the circle, its shadow consuming the room as it turned its empty gaze toward me. You dare defy me? The figure snarled, its voice layered with 1,000 others. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. What is that? I gasped. The alchemist, Marlowe said, his tone grim but steady. He won't release you without a fight. Stand firm. The creature lunged toward me, its tendrils reaching out like claws. My body froze, paralyzed by its oppressive presence. The air felt like ice, each breath a struggle as its voice echoed in my mind. You are mine. Marlowe shouted something I couldn't comprehend, and the creature recoiled, its form flickering as if unstable. It's bound to the locket, he yelled. You must sever its connection. How? You'll know, if you're willing to pay the price. The locket began to pulse, each beat sending waves of agony through my chest. The creature screamed, its tendrils lashing out in fury, shattering the walls around us. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, my hand instinctively reaching for the locket. The moment my fingers touched it, a surge of memories flooded my mind, faces twisted in despair, lives consumed by darkness, and the alchemist's hollow laughter weaving through it all. No more, I whispered. With every ounce of strength, I wrenched the locket apart. The room exploded with light. The explosion of light engulfed the room, erasing everything in a blinding, searing brilliance. I screamed, though I couldn't hear my voice over the deafening roar that came from everywhere and nowhere. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burning metal and decay. Then, as quickly as it began, the light vanished. I opened my eyes to find the room shrouded in a heavy, unnatural darkness. The locket's shattered remains lay at the center of the ritual circle, its jagged edges glowing faintly with an otherworldly green hue. Tendrils of black mist rose from the fragments, curling and writhing like dying snakes. The alchemist's form hung above the circle, its once monstrous shape now frail and flickering, like a shadow on the verge of being extinguished. Its hollow eyes burned with hatred, as it reached a skeletal hand toward me. "You cannot escape," it rasped, its voice barely more than a whisper. The shadows around the room stirred. They writhed and expanded, creeping toward me like living ink, cold and suffocating. I stumbled backward, the weight of them pressing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. "Finish it." Marlowe's voice cut through the suffocating dread. He stood at the edge of the circle, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. "The ritual isn't complete. Destroy the fragments." I hesitated, my heart pounding. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, but something rooted me in place. The alchemist's voice slithered into my mind, low and insidious. "Destroy me, and you will carry the mark forever. Do you think this ends with a broken trinket? You are mine." The tendrils lashed out, brushing against my legs, and I cried out as an icy pain shot through me. I clenched my fists, the memory of the locket's torment fresh in my mind. I couldn't let it win. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged forward, grabbing a piece of the shattered locket. It was searing hot, burning my palm as I raised it above my head and brought it down against the floor with all my strength. The fragment shattered into dust, and the alchemist screamed, a sound so piercing and guttural that it reverberated through my very bones. The shadows recoiled, writhing and flailing as they were sucked back into the remains of the locket. Piece by piece, I smashed the fragments, each strike sending waves of light through the room. The alchemist's form grew weaker, smaller, until it was little more than a wisp of smoke. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, it dissolved, its essence sucked into the dust left behind. Silence fell. I collapsed to the floor, trembling as the weight lifted from my chest. My vision blurred with exhaustion, and my breathing came in ragged gasps. "It's over," Marlowe said, his voice weary. But I wasn't so sure. We burned the locket's remains in the estate's crumbling hearth. The flames crackled and roared, swallowing the cursed fragments until nothing but ash remained. I should have felt relief, but instead, I was filled with a gnawing emptiness. The whispers were gone. Yes, but the shadows had left their mark. The air around me felt heavier now, as though something unseen lingered just out of reach. As Marlowe packed his belongings, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've severed its hold, but curses don't end so easily. Keep your wits about you, and never forget what you faced." His words chilled me, though I nodded silently. I returned home the next morning, my apartment feeling cold and foreign despite its familiarity. I tried to convince myself that the ordeal was over, that I could return to a normal life. But the signs were already there. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt it, the faintest sensation of weight pressing on my chest. My breaths grew shallow as I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. And faint, almost imperceptible, came the sound of a whisper. "Mine." The locket was gone, but its curse had left a part of itself behind. As I closed my eyes, fear clawed at my chest, and I knew some things never truly end.